Main engine throttle up. And let's light this candle. Hello, and welcome back to the McDude Project. This is our first launch of the Ares 5B Lunar Heavy Lift rocket. The last rocket was the Ares 7. It was based on the Delta IV design. When it didn't work, I expanded it from 2 boosters to 4. It still didn't work. It had this rotation built into it that I just couldn't figure out. So what I did was I went back to the Ares 5A, which was my first orbital launch vehicle, and I just added 2 boosters and some winglets to it. Changed out the upper stage to to add a lander to it. The lander is rather tall because I'm not very fuel efficient in this game. So I decided to use the long fuel tank, even though a lot of people use the short one, just to make sure, just to compensate for all the fuel that I waste in this game. You'll notice that Jebediah Kerman is joining us for this flight. I figured, since it's our first flight to the moon, it made sense to add him. And because he's our crack test pilot in Kerbal Space Program. At just over 10,000 meters, we make the nose over to 90 degrees. We're just about on target, 95 degrees. We're not too far off. All systems are nominal. All engines are running at peak efficiency. We're using the fuel cross-feed to route fuel down into the main tank. We're just about to run out of fuel on the boosters. The top of the boosters are held together with struts, which, when the boosters run out, the struts end up acting like a sleeve. It very neatly slides right off the main rocket, which you're about to witness. Boom, there they go. And we keep going. The main rocket has a fair amount of fuel. Actually, has a full tank. I have plenty of time to go ahead and set up my maneuver node to get me into orbit. It's not a very efficient orbit. We're still flying along rather fast and furiously, and I really don't have a lot of time to launch into the next into the maneuver node itself. You'll notice I'm at T-minus 18 seconds for a 2-minute burn, so I have to move the craft around as quickly as possible. While RCS and SAS are very efficient at doing this, the long spacecraft means that the craft has to stabilize itself. I'm using the LBT-30 or LTV-30 engines, which are the large non-gimbling engine bells, so I have more power, but I don't have any thrust vectoring at the other end. And one thing I've started to notice in this game is with the longer rockets, you really need thrust vectoring at both ends of the spacecraft. Otherwise, you're putting excess pressure. Since I only have RCS on one side of the spacecraft, you notice I'm putting excess pressure on that end. I'm having used just a tremendous amount of RCS fuel. Regardless, we continue on with the burn, going at full power, trying to get us into orbit. The engine burns out. We jettison the stage, move on to the next stage. The second stage engine uses the LBT-45 engine, which is the thrust vectoring engine. It adds increased stability to the spacecraft, and it'll make it considerably easier to maneuver throughout the last stages of orbit. As we continue the burn, you can see where my orbit slowly begins to grow. I check out the apoapses. I really don't need to go that high. spin the map around. I probably should have changed the focus to Kerbin instead of the spacecraft, because it's kind of hard to get a view from directly above. But as the periapsis starts to climb, I usually wait until it maxes out, and after the periapsis maxes out, that's when I cut the burn, even if I end up cutting the burn early. There's just no sense in wasting fuel going to this gigantic apoapsis when the periapsis isn't going to climb at all. It's better to just wait until I get to the apoapsis and then even out the burn and either raise the periapsis or wait till I go all the way back around to the periapsis and then raise the apoapsis, whichever route I plan to take, if I plan to stay in orbit. But I don't. Instead, I take time out to see if it's possible to go to the Mun directly from here. And at this point, and this video is a couple months old. I've been playing. I've since figured maneuver nodes out a lot better. But at that point, they were rather cumbersome to work with. And it was very difficult to, well, just figure out how the things worked. And I usually stayed just with the green maneuver nodes. In future videos, I'll show you how to use the other two, because I've since become pretty good at using the maneuver nodes. Anyway, fast forwarding a little bit, we go ahead and we start our burn towards the Mun. And this one isn't going all that well, in that the trajectory that they're showing me gives me encounter, and I end up burning beyond what the flight computer told me to, what the nav ball told me to. And that puts me on a path for an encounter with the Mun, with the periapsis of 30,000 meters. Now, after I turn off my maneuver node, if you take a good look at the orange ball, which shows the Mun's projected location at the end of the flight, you'll notice that the periapsis tag has disappeared. And the reason why is when you set these long-range maneuver nodes, they can get kind of funky. And as it turns out, I didn't have a periapsis or 30,000 meters. Instead, I was on a collision course with the Mun. And that was my first mistake. My second mistake was that it was 2 o'clock in the morning and I was very tired. And I started nodding off about now. And when I finally woke up, I went in the wrong direction. I hit the wrong button for time warp. And I accelerated when I should have decelerated. And by the time I realized what was going on, it was too late to pull out. You'll notice that I pan back, I zoom in, I look around, and I'm probably wide awake now, but I'm in total disbelief that, and yes, I've lost spacecraft before trying to go to the moon, but always to something more normal. Usually a technological glitch, not falling asleep. I'm just in total disbelief as I pan all the way out, pan back in, and then finally the splash screen comes up. It confirms for me my worst fears that I just flew into the moon. And that's how my first recorded flight to the moon ended. Which brings me to my second attempt. This is the closest that I've gotten to landing on the Mun. So we go ahead and we get ready to deploy the landing gear. We get ready to swing the spacecraft around. Bill Kerman so far is rather calm. we're at 41,000 meters and descending. As I go looking for the retrograde on the nav ball. The idea at this point is to just ride the retrograde down to the surface. We have I have about 70% of the monopropellant left. I have about half a tank of fuel, which I think is enough to get me down and get me and get Bill home again. Orient the craft around. Line it up. I get a little bit anal about this, but at this point, this was the closest I've gotten to the mun. While I'd watched a series of tutorials, I'd read the forums, I watched Scott Manley's videos, I've watched other people's videos. I had a good idea as to how to get down to the mun. The problem was translating it into, translating instructions into actions, if you will, which is easier said than done. But I put the aircraft in the retrograde, check my orientation, my lowest point in the orbit, start firing the engines a little bit, orient myself a little bit. 19,000 meters in descending. And one of the things I do is I try looking at the camera to see what's the best view when landing a lander. What's the best view for this in relation to the ground? Because I have to have a good view of the ground and have a good view of the spacecraft. I start orienting the spacecraft downward. Somehow I'm outrunning the retrograde. It's unusual. The retrograde just isn't climbing. And that was one thing about this descent that I didn't understand, why the retrograde wasn't climbing. At 12,000 meters, it should be going up towards the top of the nav ball, but it wasn't. And maybe I just should have outrun it. But I start burning fuel. Bill Kerman is still calm, still with us. We run the engine at 700 meters per second, which is just way too fast, so I have to slow the spacecraft down. I start firing. And again, I think one of my mistakes here was I should have outrun the retrograde. I should have just pointed the spacecraft further down, but I didn't do that. So we continue burning in our descent. 6,000 meters in descending. Still have a tank of fuel. 68% of my monopropellant, so we're still pretty good. And the retrograde starts going down, and that's one thing I understand, why the retrograde was descending down towards the horizon instead of going up towards the top of the nav ball. Meanwhile, the spacecraft is just not slowing down the way I need it to. So I go ahead and I raise the aircraft's attitude just a bit with the idea of trying to force the retrograde up. Because the forum wasn't quite clear in this aspect. And about this time, Bill starts panicking. I've always wondered if maybe when the Kerbals start panicking, if that's like a sign of things to come, maybe they know something I don't. And of course the ground scatter shows up, and then the shadow, and then the crash. And I still don't know what I did wrong on this landing. It was looking, well, it never did look good all the way up to the end. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and stay tuned, because in our next episode, we get closer to touchdown on the MUN.